All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Good afternoon. It's really exciting to resume this series this fall, which offers a lot of essential information to our engagement in communities beyond campus and sets us up for understanding structures that govern us and our roles within them. My name is Emily Ryan. I am the director of the Commons at KU, where we work to bring people together across interests and expertise to inform broader conversations. And today I'm thrilled to welcome you to this event, which is the 8th in the Educate and Act series, which the Commons has co-hosted with the Emily Taylor Center for Women and Gender Equity and the Center for Service Learning since spring of 2020. And today we're honored to co-host this session with the School of Social Welfare and Associate Professor of Practice in the school, Melinda Lewis. I want to recognize my collaborators in this effort, Meg Williams and Bulong Ramiz Hall at the Emily Taylor Center for Women and Gender Equity, and Jamela Watson-Thompson and Kate Kemper at the Center for Service Learning, which is doing a remarkable job of offering education and programming around Voter Education Week this week. Let's see, get back to I'm joining you today from what is currently known as Lawrence, Kansas, where the University of Kansas is located. And as we learn more today about legislation that governs us, I want to make space for reflection on the myriad governments that have existed in this place prior to that of the state of Kansas and those that coexist with it today, including those of the federally recognized Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, the Kickapoo tribe in Kansas, the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska, and the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. And I'm making a point to mention this as we consider this moment in history and recognize that this land has been home to many different histories, which can all be accessed to inform our present and also our future. I'm really grateful to be welcoming you to today's session, which is an opportunity for us to act in accord with what we know about this place and our responsibility to it. So we envisioned this series in the fall of 2019, thinking ahead to 2020 and the numerous opportunities to get involved then through the census and elections and addressing barriers to participation. And then it became clear that we could spotlight regular engagement opportunities to really highlight the importance of active community engagement at all times, not just in an election year. So we continue to offer these events as a way to articulate how research and classroom learning can translate to civic engagement and to understanding policy, and ultimately to connect you with the tools that you need to identify your own agency as a citizen or community member. It is a series that targets issues of inequity and one that connects information with resources for action, how and where you can get involved. So with that context, a few last announcements, and then we'll get started. So please leave your microphone muted during the presentation portion of the event, just so that we don't have any noise interference. We are recording today's session, which will be posted later on the Emily Taylor Center's YouTube channel. After each of the panelists have spoken for a few minutes, Professor Lewis will engage the panel with a few questions, and then we will open up to audience questions. So please, at that point, feel free to enter questions in the chat and then also use the raise hand feature. And Professor Lewis will call on you to speak your questions. I have turned on the automated captions for this event, so they're auto-generated, so they're not 100% accurate, but they do a pretty good job and will add an extra layer of accessibility to today's discussion, should you choose to use them. And then at this point, I am happy to introduce you to today's speakers. So I'll give just a brief introduction to let you know who's here today, and they'll each share more about their work and interests as they speak. They're all committed to this work through their different roles, and we'll get a chance to hear more from them in these capacities. So speaking first today will be Steve Allton, who works in KU's Office of the General Counsel, who will offer a broad overview of the language of House Bill 2183, as well as the status of current litigation. After that, Associate Professor of Political Science, Patrick Miller, will offer some context relating to how this legislation compares to recent bills in other states. Peyton Browning from Prairie Roots will tell us a little bit more about what this organization does and how it works within the statutes of this legislation. And finally, Birdie, your Student Senate Government Relations Director, will offer perspectives on how to be actively involved and how student studies can intersect with the work of being involved as well. So Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon talking about a very interesting and important topic. In way of background, while election issues come up from time to time, it is certainly not the thing that I deal with on a regular basis. So I can tell you with a high degree of certainty that I am not an expert in election law. This is a very niche field, and there are people that devote their lives to these kinds of issues. And with the litigation that pops up, you will actually see a lot of them involved all over the country when election cases are litigated. But I've been tasked today with providing kind of the template, the overview of House Bill 2183 and House Bill 2332 to provide basically the template for the rest of the panel to discuss what this means and where we're potentially going. So with that in mind, we'll get started. Prior to enactment of House Bill 2183, we already had a series of election laws that were mostly found in Chapter 25 of the Kansas Statutes Annotated. So in the wake of the 2020 presidential election, of course, we saw a lot of litigation concerning election and election processes in various states throughout the country. So in spring, then, we saw that our own Kansas legislature passed legislation, and it morphed several times before it got passed, that was then vetoed by the governor. The legislature was able to override the veto, and the legislation then went into effect on July 1st. So generally speaking, House Bill 2183 and the portion of House Bill 2332 relate to advance mail ballots, duties of election officers, voter information reporting, electioneering, and it creates a new crime concerning false representation of an election official that we'll talk about in more detail. And that's probably the provision that has gotten the most media attention and that a lot of you may already be aware of. So for House Bill 2183 that is currently in effect, there are basically 8 main changes to previous law. The first is that House Bill 2183 amends election law to make it unlawful for any person to knowingly backdate or otherwise alter a postmark if the intent is to make the mailing date appear different than the actual date of mailing. This provision then is a level 9 non-person felony. As we go through these as well, the differences in the penalties will be of interest. And just generally speaking, there will be some that are felonies, which for you that don't have a criminal background or a legal background, higher generally penalties than a misdemeanor, which is a lower level criminal penalty. So the second change is that it requires signature matching on advanced voting ballots. So before an election official may accept an advanced voting ballot, the election official first has to look at the signature, make sure it matches the signature that is on file for that voter in the county, and will not accept the ballot unless it has been verified either electronically or by an in-person review. This is only not the case if someone has a disability that would prevent them from signing in some way that could then be verified. The third change is that it reduces or restricts the Secretary of State's authority. So previously, the Secretary of State had the authority to extend the advance mail ballot deadline. That is no longer the case. So under continuing law, the deadline for the county election office to receive advance mail voting ballots is the last mail delivery on the 3rd day following an election. So while previously there were instances where that could be enlarged, that is no longer the case, at least by the Secretary of State. The fourth concerns information. So the fourth is that the Secretary of State has to publish certain voter registration statistics on the official website at times that are stated within the bill. So the information is the total number of registered voters in each county, the total number of registered voters who have mail that is undeliverable, which is interesting, as a percentage of all voters of the county, the total number of registered voters for each political party, and the total number of registered voters in each voting precinct with each political party as voters affiliated. So all of this information has to be provided by the secretary on the official website within the parameters provided by the bill. Fifth, the House bill prohibits any person from delivering an advance ballot unless they do something at the same time. So a person delivering an advance ballot at the time of delivery has to deliver a written statement that says that that person has not exercised any undue influence over the voter. And that has to be signed by both the deliverer of the ballot as well as the voter. And if this is not provided, the ballot will not be accepted. And this has to be on a form that is established by the secretary. It also restricts the number of advance ballots that a person can deliver to 10. It also prohibits a candidate from delivering an advance ballot unless delivering an advance ballot of an immediate family member. So for this particular section, these are all Class B misdemeanors. So again, lower level criminal offenses. Sixth, it expands the definition of electioneering, or generally speaking, what a candidate may not do during the course of an election, to several things, including that the candidate cannot touch or handle a voter's ballot during the voting process, again, unless it is an immediate family member. A candidate may not distribute or count ballots. A candidate may not hinder or obstruct a voter from entering or leaving a polling place, or may not hinder or obstruct an election board worker from performing election duties. And a candidate may not, these do not apply to the secretary, again. So for these as well, these three new parts of electioneering, these are continuing to be Class C misdemeanors, which they were previously as well. So 7, House Bill 2183 prohibits an election official from knowingly accepting money for costs related to administering an election unless it's otherwise allowed by law. And then 8, and this is the one that most people are aware of and that the media has covered a lot of, and it's that House Bill 2183 creates the crime of false representation of an election official. The language of this is important. So the language states that it is defined as knowingly representing oneself as an election official, or knowingly engaging in conduct that gives the appearance of being an election official, or knowingly engaging in conduct that would cause another person to believe a person is an election official. This also defines an election official. And for this particular provision, again, then this is a level 7 non-person felony. So, of course, a higher criminal offense. There is one other part of a different House bill, and that's 2332, and that basically limits out-of-state vendors or out-of-state persons from delivering an advance voting ballot. So for these items, after or on the cusp of it being passed, after the veto was overridden, several different voting groups challenged the entirety of 2183 as well as the part of 2332 that I just mentioned on a variety of legal bases. So these include the fact that it's a violation of free speech, that it's unconstitutionally overbroad, it's void for vagueness. There were several different legal theories attached to this. As part of that, these groups filed a motion for a temporary restraining order, which is basically a way for these groups to try to get the judge to limit the false representation provision from continuing on in effect until the full lawsuit is heard. So this motion for the temporary restraining order was heard fairly recently. And about a month or so ago, Shawnee District Court Judge Teresa Watson ruled and denied the motion for the temporary restraining order. Judge Watson focused on the word knowingly and stated, and I quote, "Knowingly means that the actor must be aware of his or her conduct or circumstances and aware that the conduct is reasonably certain to cause the prohibited result." Quote, "False representation of an election official is knowingly engaging in any of the described conduct. This focuses on the culpable mental state of the actor, not the subjective impression of the bystander." So of course, the voter groups that filed the preliminary injunction motion disagreed with this assessment and have filed appeals, which will then go up and be heard. So along with the preliminary injunction, which is ultimately just a part of the overall lawsuit, the remainder of the lawsuit about all the other provisions remain and has not been heard. So this lawsuit, I expect to go on for quite some time, but the current status is that all parts of the bill as written are currently in effect. So the takeaways for our campus community are twofold, really. And one is that it's incumbent on anybody that does this kind of work, whether it's voter education, voter registration, anything like that, to know what the actual language is of these new laws so that these groups can prevent any sort of claim of undue influence, etc. And that, of course, applies to the advanced voter ballots and, of course, then to the false representation of an election official. I know that certain groups for the false representation have thought of different ways to kind of counteract that. Main one being that you would see buttons that say, I am not an election official. That would be printed on all materials. That would be spoken prior to any interaction, etc. The voting groups have said that regardless of these efforts, people still may believe that they're election officials, which is part of the concern, along with a myriad of other legal theories, again, that are in the main petition. But again, as of this date, the bill is fully in effect. So with the text of all that being discussed, I hope that provides a nice platform for our other speakers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Patrick, would you like to speak next?
Sure, and I'll put my stopwatch on here, try to cap myself. 5 minutes. Let me also say up front that another hat I wear is I am the vice chair of ksvotes.org. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-political, but I guess political is the word subjective because voter registration is apparently a very political thing. But we are a nonpartisan, non-campaign oriented 501c3, and our goal has been to create an accessible online voter registration platform for Kansans. And we have, through the last several years, about 80,000 Kansans have used our website to register to vote online. About 100,000 have used it to request an online ballot, not online ballot, use the online platform to request an absentee or mail ballot. So kind of two hats I wear, and that'll tie into the representation of election officials part. So these bills do a lot. So let me kind of go through my notes here and talk really about what I think are the main political points, but also how this compares to other states. I'll also say, in 2 years of Zoom, I've never really quite nailed where I should be looking, and I typically look at myself. So I am looking at you. So I guess let's talk about maybe the easiest part to deal with, the part about restricting election authority. Not altering election laws, not accepting money to fund elections, for example. This is really something that we saw creep up in response to the 2020 election. What we saw with the COVID situation was that various people who had authority in the election process, whether that would be governors, secretaries of state or local elections officials, they used various mechanisms to make emergency alterations to how the election would be conducted. One of those would be their actual authority under emergency laws or gray areas left by the law. So a good example would be Houston, Texas, for example, where the county election official who was responsible for implementing elections at the local level implemented a plan where people could vote from their car. So they would take a parking garage and set up a balloting station in the parking garage, and kind of like a drive-up COVID test. You would drive up with your mask and you would just vote in your car. Same exact thing as physically going into a place, but you're just doing it not in a building. The state of Texas took issue with that, sued over that, claiming that the election official was radically altering election processes and setting up a polling precinct without the authority of the state. That's really the kind of thing that we're talking about here. Things with polling places, things with if there's any leniency on when a mail ballot has to arrive. That's really what's being targeted. in this to make sure that legislatures are taking as much authority as possible to control that process for themselves. This is really restricting the authority of other people who are involved in the elections process. The accepting money part, some local elections officials around the country have accepted outside nonprofit grants to set up things like voter education programs, or they didn't have enough money to fund as many polling places as they would like, so they might take like a nonprofit grant to do that. So that would be restricted in theory in this bill. I guess the next easiest thing to deal with would be, and I'll say on that point, I don't see a lot of direct implications for that part to what we have seen here in Kansas. I think what's happening with a lot of these bills is that model legislation has been put out, particularly by conservative organizations, that then gets mimicked at the state level, no matter whether that legislation really directly addresses something that's happening at the state level. Our Secretary of State already had some emergency authority to alter the election procedure that he did not use. So I think this is really kind of national forces trickling into Kansas. I guess the next easiest part is to deal with the ballot collection. The term that gets put on here is ballot harvesting. It basically means returning someone else's ballot for them. Overwhelmingly, most voters return their own ballots one way or another. But if you have to think about who is relying on someone else's help, you might give it to your spouse. You might ask them to walk to the mailbox for you to deposit it. If you do that, you're a ballot harvester. People who are sick, elderly, and disabled are far more likely to rely on a family member or a caregiver, whether they are in care at home or whether they are in some kind of long-term residential facility. So we might see people returning other people's ballots for them there. We also see this commonly in churches, not as much here in Kansas. We don't see a lot of this in Kansas. Again, national forces trickling in, but like Georgia, for example, a lot of African-American churches, but also a lot of really conservative white evangelical churches will engage in this. To make sure members' ballots get back. We also see this on Native American reservations, particularly large rural ones where people might be living hours away from a post office. It's very common to see a group of people give their ballots to one person. So it's just that one person who has to make that long trek, sometimes on unpaved roads, to deposit those ballots. So that's really what we're talking about. This isn't regulated in 13 states, and in the other states, it is regulated to various degrees. We actually have some of the more lenient regulations on this, honestly, even with this new law. Your most restrictive would be Alabama, where it is illegal for any reason to return anyone else's ballot. So in Alabama, if your spouse asks you to take their ballot to the mailbox for them, you are committing a prosecutable felony in Alabama. Other states, they just regulate who can do it. A caregiver, a family member, a friend has to be chosen. Sometimes they have to sign for that. They also regulate the number. We're allowing 10, Nebraska allows 2, New Jersey allows 3. So different variations. And just running a little bit over, but just very quickly on the impersonating an election official issue. Again, something we don't actually see a lot of. There's are many problems that do occur in elections, and sometimes we do have some issues with things that concern us about crime or dishonesty, but this is generally not one of them. Few cases here and there. So the exact implications of this will be interesting. I will just say, putting on my other hat as the vice chair of KS Votes, we are not part of this lawsuit. On our website, we say explicitly that we are not election officials. I am worried for myself personally, as someone who is part of this organization, that even though we are putting out there, we are not election officials, we are not the state of Kansas, you could still believe that that is what we are, right? You could still say, well, I thought this was a state of Kansas online registration portal, and then complain to us or treat us as if we are. And then in that circumstance, even though I have said I am not an election official, if you think I am because you didn't pay attention, am I then someone who could be prosecuted for a felony? I have a real concern about that. It's not stopping our organization from continuing the operation of KS Votes, and no one has sued us yet, as far as I know, and we're not involved in this, but I think it is a legitimate concern, vagueness of this law in particular. So That's it.
Thanks, Patrick. Peyton, would you like to speak next?
Sure. Thanks. I am Peyton Browning. I'm the executive director of Prairie Roots. We are a 501c4 nonprofit organization, and we do year-round organizing, specifically around progressive issues, and specifically around engaging non-voters. So people who are already registered to vote, but have never actually gotten out to vote and gone to their ballot box, dropped in their mail-in ballot, anything like that. And what we the way that we do this is through deep canvassing. And if you aren't familiar with deep canvassing, it's just a little different than your normal canvassing with like campaigns or ballot measures. Those conversations for a candidate that you might canvass for in the past, those conversations usually last 5 to 10 minutes long and have a 7-day impact on a voter, where deep canvassing conversations last from 20 minutes to 60 minutes and have an up to 9-month impact on the voter. And deep canvassing really is, our script is different for kind of involving them in a different way. So instead of coming up to voters and saying, these are our issues that we want you to support or believe in, vote for, we are just listening to them and really engaging them in a different way, meeting them where they are, hearing what issues they're facing, and then tying that into the voting process. How this kind of all relates to these House bills that are going on is, these House bills are in some way meant for fear of political engagement and voter engagement. And canvassing is not illegal and voter engagement is not illegal. And, it's very vague, so it's hard to feel protected in this situation with these bills. What we've been doing is canvassing with the badges that say I'm not an election official. I know that several other organizations have been doing that as well. Or we put it into the conversation when we're bringing them in through that, bring them along the conversation for the issues that they're facing and tying that into the voting process and the power of their vote, bringing that in and educating them, being like, this is what's going on across the state. And this is why maybe people don't reach out to you, or this is why people might not reach out to you this year. Or they introduce themselves at the beginning of the conversation as I'm not an election official. As for voter registration, I know several other organizations, because of this bill, have halted all of their voter registration efforts, which is saddening for, just really having a democracy and engagement across our state for new voters, previous voters, and updating voter registration forms and such. What we've been doing is we print out the voter registration forms and hand that out to people, but we don't fill them out for them. We don't return them for them. We have nothing to do with it after we give them the form. And yeah, so our kind of thing is keep organizing on the ground and canvassing and being a community member. We don't even mention ourselves as when we're canvassing, like I'm from Prairie Roots, I'm with, my county group, my party, anything like that. We just say, I'm your neighbor. Everyone's canvassing in their own areas. And with these bills, like we're still at risk. There's no, lawyer stamp of approval saying you're safe on really any of these measures. And what we just really focus on is tying it back into individuals voting. And if you'd like to get involved with Prairie Roots, you can go to our website. It's prairieRootsKS.com, and there should be a link to a button to volunteer. And you can sign up to see our deep canvassing shifts and trainings and kind of figure out what works best for you and how you can start having these conversations, even though these bills are existing.
Thanks,
No,
Peyton.
pass it off.
Do you mind putting the link in the chat too? Just thank you. I think the caption got it a little bit off when you were saying the URL. So thank you. All right, Birdie, are you ready for speaking next?
Yeah. So like Emily said at the beginning, I'm the Student Senate Government Relations Director. So in that position, I help coordinate like voter registration and education events on campus throughout the year. And I make sure that students have those opportunities. So House Bill 2183 has certainly put a damper on some things for us and definitely caused a lot of, like from the student perspective, there's a lot of fear about, am I going to get a felony if I stand on Wesco Beach and register people to vote? So that's sort of what I've been dealing with. but I also serve on the Student Legislative Action Committee, which is a part of Senate, the KU ACLU, the Civic Engagement and Leadership Council, and the Student Advisory Board. Both of those are with the Dole. And those are really great ways to get involved with voter registration and education, or just with issues that involve like politics here in Kansas. The KU ACLU has events like this all the time, where people like representatives will come in and talk to us about what's happening in the legislature and then how you can help. And things that fall under that are like going to city commission meetings, or, you know, emailing your representative, or, you know, going and talking to them at their office. And there's just a lot of ways to get involved, especially if like voter registration under this law scares you, which I will say I'm also nervous about doing it. But there are a lot of really great ways to get involved. And I'm not a political science major. I am a communications major, and then a news and information major at the J School. And this is still really, really relevant in everything that I do. We talk about this stuff all the time, in terms of, you know, how do I, you know, communicate that I'm not an election official, or, you know, how do I spread the word that House Bill 2183 is a thing, and you should be focused on how are you representing yourself in these spaces. So even if you're not a political science major, like I would highly recommend, if this interests you at all, in coming to more things like with the Center for Service Learning or with the ACLU and things like that. Like also, especially if you're not a political science major, because this affects students in all kinds of ways, whereas it might affect a like engineering student differently than it affects an art student, differently than it affects a communications major, especially in the way that you might engage civically. So I would just highly recommend, if this interests you at all. There are plenty of ways to get involved. I would recommend going to Rock Chalk Central, or you can always email me. And we can get you involved. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Birdie. Melinda, would you like to offer some questions?
Yeah, I want to see first if there are questions. Can we, maybe I can change it myself just so I can see everybody. There we go, at one time. So first want to see if there are questions that folks have, points of clarification, or to Birdie's last point, you know, thinking about how this lands differently for people who are students in different parts of the university or people from other units on campus. So would be interested in hearing from folks first about questions that you want our panelists who come to this work from different places as well to address. I'm inordinately comfortable with silence, Emily. It's one of the most awkward things I do to my students. I have 4 kids and we're all loud. So when I have a chance to just sit in a little silence for a while, I can do it for way longer than most people are comfortable. Yeah, Robert?
Yeah, I have a question for Mr. Allen. He stated that the state Secretary of State is going to have a finite amount of time to accept mail-in ballots. That you said that, correct, sir? And the next thing is that with what we've heard about the United States Post Office is going to be slowing stuff down, are they going to amend the state bill? And secondly, what occurs if the voting date is November 8th, November 11th is a federal holiday? Do they back up the date for receiving ballots or what?
So I think the answer to that is, I don't know. I think with some of these, the postmark date is going to be very important. There could be litigation, right, concerning if a outside or third party entity that has it on the postmark date then doesn't deliver it within the normal parameters. I could see that being litigation. And I think the postmark date is what's usually going to be very important, and not necessarily the delivery, but that's not the way it is right now, right? We have a time for delivery, and if it's not done within that delivery, we also have an issue. So I don't know. I definitely think there will probably be issues around this. I don't know that the legislature would take that up. It'll be interesting to watch it play out. I wish I could give you more instruction there, but I just don't have it.
Thanks for the great questions, Robert. Patrick, do you have any, I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball about what's the legislature going to do, or how would a judge rule, what would be an individual's right of action, even if their ballot was delayed, but thoughts about how you're seeing this play out in Kansas and in other places where votes and voting rights are contested?
Well, I mean, in terms of Kansas, I have zero expectation that anything that fixes or clarifies or makes this more lenient is going to get through the legislature. Rather, my expectations in the next session, we're probably going to see bills to further put restrictions in place in one way or another. That's just not the politics of that building at this point in time. You know, that said, I mean, I think in comparison to what we are seeing in other states, what we have seen here in Kansas, at least since the 2020, many times can I say that, 2020 election, is not as like far reaching as what we're seeing in someplace like Georgia, where it is far more restrictive in terms of the various regulations that are being put in place, and not only opening activists up to felony prosecutions, but even voters. So we're definitely not on that scale. Of course, you know, we have a little bit of a different political operation here in terms of what's actually happening in our state versus others. You know, I think if we're looking for what is the biggest thing here that might have some implications carrying out beyond Kansas, or even the biggest political reverberations within the state, it is that impersonating an election official point, just because we don't know how that's going to pan out. You know, I mean, and I will tell you, like, I have conversations with people, like, there are people in that building in Topeka who meant no malice in this, in terms of routine things are being done in terms of voter registration, but there are also people in that building who thoroughly hoped that this would shut down everything that voter registration activists are doing. And I wouldn't homogenize them as being of one point of view. I mean, especially again, because a lot of these bills get sent to state legislators from outside groups that say, hey, this is a good idea, do this in your state. So, you know, I don't even think it's, except for making regulations tighter, different legislators have different motivations. So I wouldn't overcharacterize that, but the courts are just a whole other issue, and I really don't have a crystal ball on that one, unfortunately.
Thanks, Patrick. I appreciate the candor and the lack of foresight. They're just the things we can't see entirely, I guess, and also the reminder that there are a lot of different interests pressing on this issue as others. Other questions that folks have in response to the panel, to Robert's really important questions about how's this really going to play out in light of delays and calendars and real life. Other questions that folks have for these four? So one thing that I would be interested in, oh, hang on, there's a question here. So question for everyone who everyone may not be looking at the screen, about what it means for people who volunteer as canvassers on behalf of a political party. So those who are doing partisan, registration, but I would assume also potentially other types of get out the vote work. Is that an affected activity under the law? What does it mean for folks who engage in that kind of civic participation in action? Anybody want to take that for Whitney?
Because I'll jump in because no one else is. My reading of the situation is that they would get treated the same as anyone else. Take for example, impersonating an election official, if the way that this is going to pan out is that no matter what you say as the nonpartisan registration activist or the partisan canvasser, even saying I'm not an election official, if the way this pans out is that all it takes is someone to think that you are, or to say that they think that you are, even though they know you aren't, if that's going to lead to there being legal situations, and I think everyone will be equally vulnerable here, no matter what kind of an organization that you're working for. If we were a state where there really was a history of this kind of partisan ballot collection process, going to the ballot harvesting issue, I would say there would be more of a concern there. But to my knowledge, we don't have a big history of that in this state. North Carolina, for example, would be a state that actually that is part of the campaign culture there. They would be more affected. In fact, there was fraud related to that, and they had to redo a congressional race in 2018. But for that, in terms of Kansas, if you are a partisan activist, or if you're a nonpartisan activist, I mean, the easy way around this is just get a whole bunch of volunteers and you take in your 10. And then there's no cap on how many your organization can take in. Or if you're at a nursing home and you're returning ballots for residents, each staff member does 10. But we really don't have a lot of that here in Kansas. And again, national legislation being shifted down to the state level.
Thank you. Other questions that folks want to put in the chat? So Emily asked whether we can get some clarity on, is the onus on the person being accused of impersonating an election official to prove they weren't knowingly doing it, or is the onus on the person who is accusing to provide some evidence that it was done knowingly? So really kind of trying to interrogate this word knowingly some more, which gives me some pause too. Like, how do we think we're going to totally understand what's in someone's heart or mind? And that seems to hinge on that. Who has the burden of proof, so to speak? And I don't mean that exactly legally, Steve. I'm not a lawyer at all. But like, whose responsibility is it going to be to really flesh out this knowingly term?
So I'm going to couch this with saying that I can't give specific legal advice in this kind of a forum, right? So I can provide just some general thoughts without being too specific as to this. But again, since we're dealing with what would amount to a felony, this would be incumbent on the state to prove their their high burden for a criminal citation of a felony, right? We don't know, as far as the actual citation or an arrest or those kinds of things, what kind of conduct officers would look at or somebody else would look at to come in and make an arrest or provide a citation at this point. But again, with any type of a criminal prosecution, it's going to be the burden of the state to prove beyond a reasonable doubt for the felony that this kind of conduct occurred.
Thanks. I'm interested, this is probably more Peyton and Birdie, but I think people are going to be welcome to chime in, particularly with what Patrick was saying about what we may see in the coming legislative session, and Robert already raising several really realistic scenarios about some other complications that we may encounter. What are groups doing, or what should we all do to try to influence the context in which civic engagement happens here at the university and at the state level, and really even beyond? So if it's already gotten more complicated and a bit more challenging, and we expect that more complications are coming, what are some of the things that we should be doing, not just on the door with our buttons and the way that we introduce ourselves, but at the somewhat more macro level to influence the landscape in a way that facilitates a broad range of civic engagement activities?
For our organization, we're, in terms of that knowingly aspect, that term of what's going on is to really just direct all efforts where we have questions being asked of those kinds of things, and we just direct people to the Secretary of State to engage with the Secretary of State on their own, kind of like avoiding being taken as an election official, sorry. And then as well as, ourselves calling the Secretary of State and asking these questions anytime that they arise, and trying to be in communication with them as much as possible, because we don't know, how are those postmarks going to run out with the, days after the election, with the holiday after the election, and so on and so forth.
Birdie, what about, you mentioned advocacy and some other fronts on which you're working. So in addition to voter registration and voter turnout work, looking at ways, public education and capacity building and interaction with policymakers, what are some of the other fronts that you're working on to facilitate the kind of civic engagement you want to see?
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate for direct communication. Some of the ways in the past that like students have been able to like get things passed with the state of Kansas or with the Board of Regents is literally just going in and having meetings with them. And so myself, some other people in Senate, and some members of the Student Legislative Action Committee are planning to find our allies in the state legislature and be like, hey, we need to talk about what happened last year, because it's not just affecting, people who are impersonating election officials, right? It is, we are living in fear to help students vote. We're living in fear to help, freshmen who just turned 18, who, this could be their first election ever. We're scared to register them to vote, right? And so I would say like the best thing you can do, call your representative, call like your senator and be like, hey, this is an issue that I have with this. And as someone who voted you into office, or someone who's coming up for re-election, like, you should know this is a heavy issue for your constituents. And so that's something myself and other students will be doing. I get closer to the spring, but those conversations will start this fall, and it never hurts to badger your elected officials until they listen to you. So I would recommend that.
Thanks. Does anyone else have a question in these last 10 minutes or so? So Kate, Birdie is hoping that you might have a schedule of when various Senate committees are meeting this semester. So these would be interim committees, I think, and any thoughts about ways that you and others will be facilitating student engagement in the legislature, even in advance of the session, and I would imagine certainly once it starts.
Kate, were you talking about like student Senate committees or state Senate committees?
Oh yeah, that's probably a good clarification to make. I meant student Senate.
Okay. I was thinking, I've been doing interim committee stuff, so I just thought you were calling them Senate committees, and I was thinking that's what you were meaning. Okay.
So student Senate committees meet every other Wednesday. Student rights, university affairs, and diversity, equity, inclusion committee. All three, which would be great ones to advocate in about like university support against things like House Bill 2183, meet at 6:30. Those meet tonight as well. And then our finance committee meets at 6 p.m. But the Student Legislative Action Committee, which are usually the bigger group of people who like will go to like meetings and have these conversations with officials, meet every other Thursday at 7. And so that would be next week. But yeah, I would highly recommend that, like, if you want to gather support of students, because most students in Student Senate are politically active or politically interested, I would highly recommend coming to our committee meetings and advocating there as well, because the more student power you have, the more university power you have, and the more weight you pull with those people in the legislature.
Awesome, thanks. Other questions?
I have a quick question. I was having a conversation with Kate and Birdie the other day. Let me turn on my camera so I'm not an anonymous. having a conversation with Kate and Birdie the other day about a lawsuit. And I think Patrick also mentioned that, and that like the League of Women Voters and Loud Light are involved in. And I was just curious if there are any like updates or what that lawsuit is looking like right now. Thanks.
Yeah, so the underlying lawsuit, which challenged the entirety of House Bill 2183 and the other provision, has not been heard on the merits according to the many different legal theories. The only part of that that has been heard was the motion for the temporary injunction against the false representation provision. And that part was denied. But again, that was only a preliminary motion. The merits, or the part where all the evidence is brought in and they have arguments and the judge makes the decision on that, that has not yet occurred. So that will probably take some time, because right now the posture is that main lawsuit is sitting and the temporary injunction denial is being appealed. So that might get heard first or not. And then they may deal with the rest of the lawsuit, which encompasses the entirety of House Bill 2183. So I don't think that this is going to see resolution anytime soon. This would also depend, along with the temporary injunction appeal, right? When the merits of the entire thing are heard, then that can also get appealed. So this could be a long process. And unfortunately, I don't have any foresight as to how quickly that will move along, other than to say that the merits have not been addressed.
I will.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I will second that. I'm a fellow for Loud Light, one of the people who is a part of the lawsuit. And like Peyton said, we have stopped all voter registration. And we talk about it every meeting, but it's basically stagnant right now until that appeal is heard.
And I just wanted to add in, just in case, I think people might be struggling a little bit to understand like what the real concern is here, just kind of tie in some of the other comments about like fear. So, and your question about like the knowingly part, right? Like, I think the problem is, what does that mean? And what is the important thing here, right? So the law is trying to make a felony intentionally engaging in an activity that can make someone else think you're an election official, right? So if you are a nonpartisan person registering people to vote, even if you have your nice "I'm not an election official" button, are you knowingly engaging in a voter registration activity? Yes. Could someone not read your button and still think that you're an election official? Yes. So did you knowingly engage in an activity that could make someone else, because they didn't read your button or they didn't think about it, did you knowingly engage in an activity that could make someone think that you're an election official? Yes, you did. And I believe there was a spokesperson for, it was the Attorney General's office, who told possibly the Topeka Capital Journal, maybe the Kansas Reflector, that, well, they would only care about like the people who are really intentionally engaged in fraud. But that's also not really what the law says, right? And we could easily get another attorney general or a different county prosecutor in some place who may have a different intention or goal, or may want to be much more of an activist, partisan, or ideologue in implementing that. So that's kind of the concern. Like, you can say what your intention is now in terms of what to do with that, but the problem is what the law actually says and the vagueness of that, and that's where the fear comes from and what will need to be sorted out in court.
Thanks, Patrick. I think that's really helpful and gives voice to the way that a lot of people have been feeling. We're just about out of time, and I just wanted to, I guess, frame a little bit the way that some of us in the Civic Engagement ambassadors and the Center for Service Learning, and it sounds like, Birdie, a lot of your work with Student Senate, and certainly Peyton, I know what Prairie Roots is doing is trying to not only figure out ways to operate within the constraints that this legislation poses, but also to continually expand our understanding of what civic engagement looks like and the many ways that people engage as part of a vibrant democracy, to include voting through the paths that we can help them navigate through, but to also include participation in organizations that are changing debates and elevating different issues and developing leadership. And really, Peyton, your organization's work in having just deep conversations with people about the issues that they care about and where they see politics intersecting those issues, even if they wouldn't all trace that. So I appreciate Emily, the Commons sponsorship of these discussions and bringing people together. And we'll kick it back to you for any kind of closing remarks that you have for this and the other events in the series. But thank you very much to the panelists for sharing your time and for your leadership on issues that are changing the terms in which people can engage in issues that chart the future of all of our lives. So, Emily.
Thanks, Melinda. And yes, thank you all for sharing both what you're doing, but also what you are able to extrapolate from this new language that's coming down from Topeka. I just wanted to point out that Kate has put a helpful link in the chat for the Civic Engagement Hub, which does have a lot of helpful resources if you've got further questions, some of which might be answered there. But with that, I'll just give you 3 minutes back and say thank you so much for joining us. The next event in the series will be on December 1st, so just keep an eye out for that. And otherwise, have a good afternoon. Thank you.